The church smelled faintly of lilies and rain, clean, but heavy. The kind of air that makes every breath feel like you're carrying the whole room's silence inside your chest. I stood just outside the double doors for a long second before walking in, smoothing the sleeve of my black suit as if that small motion could steady me. People turned to look, but not the way they did when Mom was alive. Back then, they looked because she drew them in. Now, they looked to assess. I heard the first whisper before I reached the front pew. "She really wore that?" It wasn't said with cruelty at first, just curiosity laced with judgment. Then came my sister's voice, pitched perfectly between sympathy and scorn. "I told her to call me if she needed help finding something appropriate. Guess she didn't." The cousins laughed softly, just enough to feel safe behind the mask of mourning. I kept walking. My shoes didn't click as sharply as hers. My fabric didn't gleam. My hair wasn't styled for photographs. And yet I'd spent hours making sure every stitch in that suit lay exactly right. The fabric was wool crepe, soft but structured, something I'd chosen deliberately because Mom used to say, "Real quality whispers, only pretenders shout." I hadn't come to impress anyone. I came to say goodbye. But even grief, it seemed, had a dress code in my sister's world. When I took my seat, I let my hands rest in my lap. I didn't fidget. I didn't defend myself. I just stared at the casket and thought about how Mom would have hated all the show of it. The rented floral arches, the overdone makeup, the designer logos hidden under veils. She believed in effort, not performance. She would have looked at my plain black suit and said, "You look like yourself, baby. That's all that matters." The pastor started talking about legacy, about the threads of kindness we leave behind. I looked around the room and wondered what legacy my sister thought she was leaving. She sat 2 rows behind me, crossing her legs with practiced ease, her heels catching the light every time she shifted. I could almost hear the unspoken commentary running through her mind. My thrift store outfit, my small-town life, my quietness. To her, silence meant insignificance. But silence was my strength, always had been. Even as kids, she'd perform for everyone while I sat beside Mom, learning how to turn scraps of fabric into something worth keeping. I'd trace patterns while she posed for photos. We were 2 halves of the same lesson. She wanted to be seen, I wanted to create. She mocked what she couldn't understand. And maybe that's why, standing there in the same church where Mom once taught Sunday sewing classes, her voice still cut through me like a thread pulled too tight. When the choir began to sing, I bowed my head. My eyes burned, but the tears didn't come easily. I was thinking about the last time Mom saw me in one of my designs. She touched the stitching on my sleeve, smiled faintly, and said, "One day, people will wear your clothes without even knowing they're yours. That's when you'll know you've made something real." She was right. They already were. My brand had been growing quietly online, faceless and private, just as I intended. It wasn't about fame, it was about legacy. And yet, here I was being laughed at by someone wearing a dress from a company that had once begged me to collaborate anonymously. As the service ended, I rose with the others and turned toward the aisle. My sister was waiting by the doors, flanked by 2 of her friends, all dressed in black like glossy magazine covers. She smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that has teeth behind it. "You look simple," she said. "I guess that's your style." There was a time I would have explained, maybe even apologized, but that time was long gone. I just nodded. "It was Mom's favorite cut," I said softly. She tilted her head, not realizing how true that was. "Well, it's certainly humble." I let the silence stretch between us, long enough that she got uncomfortable. Then I looked down at the small silver embroidery glinting at my wrist, 3 quiet letters that the world would soon learn. The logo, she thought, was just a cheap embellishment. My name, hidden in plain sight. A camera clicked somewhere behind us. The photographer hired by the church to document the day had taken a candid shot, me standing under the stained glass window, the light falling exactly on that sleeve. He smiled, not realizing he'd captured something no one else could see yet, the moment before the truth turned visible. I didn't say another word. I didn't have to. Some truths, like the finest stitches, hold everything together long before anyone notices they're there. People always assume stories like mine start with rage, that moment when you've had enough, when someone crosses a line too many times. But that's not how this began. It started with a quieter kind of ache, the kind you feel when you realize someone who should have known your heart never really looked at it. When I left the church that afternoon, I sat in my car and stared at my reflection in the windshield. The suit that had felt like armor suddenly looked like a disguise. For a second, I wondered if my sister was right. Maybe I did look plain. Maybe I built an entire brand around the wrong kind of beauty. Then I caught a glint of the silver stitching on my cuff, and the doubt faded. That's the funny thing about being underestimated. It hurts at first, like being erased in slow motion, but if you stay still long enough, you realize it's also freedom. No one expects anything from you when they think you're small, and in that space, you can build something unstoppable. If you've ever been the quiet one at the table, the one people talk over or laugh at or forget to introduce, you'll understand what I mean. You start collecting those moments, turning them into fuel. You stop waiting for validation, and you start building receipts. Every design, every fabric order, every late-night prototype I stitched alone became a record, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd learned. That day, sitting in the car outside the church, I scrolled through my phone and opened the folder I'd named Proof. It wasn't for the world, not yet, but for myself. Screenshots of orders placed under celebrity aliases, collaborations with boutique owners who didn't know the founder was a woman who once sewed in her mother's basement. There was an email from a retailer in Paris asking for an exclusive line, and another from a lawyer confirming that my trademarks had cleared in 3 countries. I smiled to myself, half in disbelief. I'd built all of this while people like my sister still thought I was unemployed. I looked back at the church through the window. The guests were still lingering outside, shaking hands and swapping polite condolences that had more performance than sincerity. My sister was laughing again. Her laughter bright and sharp, her body turned toward a camera as if grief itself were a backdrop. I wondered how she'd tell the story later. Maybe she'd say, "My sister embarrassed herself at Mom's funeral. Poor thing." Maybe she'd even believe it. But I've learned something. When people mock you for being less than, they're often terrified of how much you're becoming. That's why they try to frame the story before you can tell it. And maybe that's why I started recording my version that very night. Not for revenge, though I'll admit, part of me wanted her to feel what it's like to be dismissed, but for record-keeping, receipts, proof that silence doesn't mean weakness, proof that kindness can be strategy. If you're listening to this, maybe you've had a sister like mine too. The one who turns insecurity into cruelty, who dresses superiority in silk. Maybe you've been mocked for wearing something simple, speaking softly, or staying humble. I want you to know humility isn't invisibility. Sometimes it's the most powerful disguise there is. When I finally drove home that day, I turned on the radio just to fill the quiet. Every song sounded like something Mom would have hummed while she worked. She never cared about applause, but she always said, "The right people will recognize your work without needing your name." I didn't realize then that her words would become prophecy, that within 48 hours, a single photograph would turn my anonymity into exposure. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let's stay in that moment, me in my car, staring at the faint reflection of a church and a sky heavy with unfinished goodbyes. My sister still smiling for cameras, unaware that her mockery had just become the first thread in her own unraveling. I remember whispering to myself, almost as a prayer, "They'll see the label soon." And in a way, that was my first invitation to you, to anyone who's ever had to hold their truth quietly. Because sometimes the best stories don't start with a scream. They start with a whisper. If you've ever been judged for what you wore, for how little you seem to have, or for being too quiet to matter, tell me in the comments how you handled it. Maybe your silence was your power too. Maybe you've got receipts of your own. Because trust me, the moment they underestimate you, that's the moment your story begins. The house on Sycamore Lane still smelled like laundry detergent and cinnamon, even years after we'd both moved out. Mom's scent lived in the walls. Every time I came home, it was like walking back into a softer version of myself, one that still believed family could be gentle. I used to spend hours in the small sewing room at the back of the house, the one that faced the garden. The window stuck a little when you opened it, but Mom liked it that way. "Keeps the drafts out," she'd say, pushing a pin through fabric with her teeth as she worked. That was where I first learned how to make something from almost nothing. Mom would hand me scraps, pieces of old curtains, leftover cotton, and challenge me to make something beautiful but useful. I'd sit cross-legged on the floor, trying to copy her movements. My sister never joined us. She'd drift in sometimes, all sighs and complaints, saying she didn't want her hands smelling like thread. Instead, she'd take Mom's credit card and head to the mall. That difference, the one between creation and consumption, would become the quiet war between us for the rest of our lives. When I was 16, Mom gave me her old Singer sewing machine. It was loud, temperamental, and heavy enough to sprain your wrist if you moved it wrong, but I loved it. I'd stay up late listening to the needle hum while everyone else slept. Sometimes I'd hear my sister coming home from parties, heels clicking on the porch, perfume trailing behind her like a flag of victory. She'd peek into my room and smirk. "Still playing dress-up," she'd say. I'd smile and nod. She didn't need to know that I was already sketching designs I planned to sell one day. The first real thing I made was a black dress stitched from Mom's old curtain fabric. It wasn't perfect, the seams were uneven, and one shoulder sat higher than the other, but it made Mom tear up when she saw it. "This," she said, touching the hem, "is how women survive. We make beauty from what's left." She insisted I wear it to church the next Sunday. My sister rolled her eyes the moment I walked in. "You made that," she said, voice dripping disbelief. "Looks like you pulled it from a donation bin." I laughed it off, but I remember the way it burned. The laughter was louder than it should have been. People joined in because that's what people do when someone confident leads the way. That was the first time I learned what humiliation felt like, not the kind that comes from shame, but the kind that comes from realizing someone you love enjoys seeing you small. Still, I kept sewing. Quietly, patiently, every mockery became motivation. I started signing each piece I made with tiny hand-stitched initials. MEL, they were hidden inside the hemline, a secret between me and the fabric. Years later, those same letters would become the name of my brand, but back then, they were just a promise to myself that I wouldn't stop. While I was making prototypes in Mom's sewing room, my sister was building a reputation on social media. She'd post pictures in designer outfits with captions like #FamilyHumbleBeginnings, pretending to be relatable. I'd scroll through her feed sometimes, torn between pride and distance. She had the audience I never wanted but secretly envied. And she had a way of making people believe she was the success story of our family. Then, during one of her influencer partnerships, she filmed a closet tour. I still remember the sting of it, her panning the camera across rows of luxury dresses and pausing at one of my earliest designs. She'd taken it without asking. "Oh, this one," she said to her followers. "A random small-town boutique sent it over. Cute, right? I mean, not my usual style, but I'll keep it." I watched that clip 3 times, heart pounding. She called it random. She didn't even recognize my work. Mom saw it too. She came into my room later that night holding a cup of tea and just said, "She doesn't see you yet, but she will." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't want to admit how much it hurt that my sister's success seemed to erase mine. After Mom passed, that house felt smaller. The sewing machine was still there, quiet and patient, like it knew it would be waiting for me. I sat at that same table one night, tracing the initials on my old pieces. MEL, the thread had faded, but the promise hadn't. I decided to build something bigger, a line that would honor Mom's belief that elegance could be honest, that you didn't need wealth to look like yourself. That's how my brand was born, not from ambition, but from memory. Every piece carried something of her discipline, her warmth, her silence. And even as orders started to come in, I never told my sister. I didn't want validation. I wanted distance. But I should have known. Secrets don't stay hidden in families like ours. And one day, the same woman who mocked my stitches would unknowingly wear my work again. This time, on the day she tried to humiliate me in front of everyone. Grief changes your sense of time. Days blend together until you can't tell whether something happened last week or last month. After Mom's funeral, the house felt hollow in a way that silence couldn't fill. My sister stayed busy planning a tribute post for her followers, complete with an edited slideshow and a caption that began with, "She taught me strength and style." I didn't correct her. It wasn't worth it. Instead, I went back to my apartment and sat at my work table surrounded by sketches and fabric samples that smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Mom had always been my quiet muse. When she got sick, I poured every ounce of fear and love into designing again. The doctors called it palliative, but I called it borrowed time. I wanted to build something before she left, something that would carry her forward. She used to joke that if she ever had her own clothing line, she'd name it Humble Thread. I took that name and shaped it into something sleeker, more marketable, HUMBL, a nod to her humor and my stubbornness. I launched it anonymously online, no pictures of me, no backstory, no family name, just clean photographs of simple, elegant pieces. I wasn't prepared for the response. Within months, the orders doubled, then tripled. Small magazines reached out for interviews, but I always declined, saying the team wanted privacy. It wasn't a team. It was just me and a retired seamstress named Nora who'd been one of Mom's old friends. She helped me source fabric and reminded me to eat. My sister didn't know any of this. She still thought I was working part-time at a thrift boutique. She'd call occasionally, her voice sweetened with condescension. "You should come to one of my influencer brunches," she'd say. "You could network. Maybe someone could give you a real job." I'd thank her politely and change the subject. It was easier than explaining that I'd just shipped an order to Milan. When Mom's health declined, my sister started showing up more often, at least when cameras were around. She'd pose beside Mom's hospital bed, post the photos, and write captions about cherishing every moment. I didn't judge her for it, not out loud. Maybe that was her way of coping. Mine was quieter. I sat beside Mom and sewed. She couldn't talk much toward the end, but her eyes followed my hands as if the rhythm comforted her. One night, just a week before she passed, she reached over and rested her hand on mine. Her skin was thin as paper. "Don't let them shame you for simplicity," she whispered. "You see things they don't." I didn't fully understand what she meant then, but I do now. She knew how the world worked, how people mistake noise for worth. After she was gone, the imbalance between me and my sister grew heavier. The estate lawyer, Mr. Grant, started contacting us about paperwork, and suddenly my sister was very interested in family matters again. "I just want to make sure everything's fair," she said, which usually meant profitable. She had a way of smiling when she said manipulative things, as though good manners could erase bad motives. Meanwhile, HUMBL was quietly gaining traction. Influencers were wearing my designs without knowing who made them, including, ironically, my sister. I watched one of her videos where she modeled a blazer she called a minimalist steal from an up-and-coming label. She loved the piece, even tagged the brand. The comments section exploded with praise, and she basked in it. She didn't realize she was advertising her own sister's work. I laughed so hard that night I had to set my phone down. Then, one morning, as I sipped coffee by the window, I saw something that made my heart lurch. A small article in the local ledger, a lifestyle column, titled "The Homegrown Elegance of HUMBL, Fashion Rooted in Integrity." It wasn't a big piece, just 3 paragraphs and a blurry photo from a charity event. But the journalist had noticed the initials on my tags and mentioned that the brand was founded by an independent designer whose name matches the late Margaret Ellison's daughter's initials. That was the first receipt, small, quiet, but traceable. My sister didn't read the ledger. She only consumed glossy magazines and social media buzz, so the clue slipped past her. I kept the clipping anyway, folded it into my journal like a secret. Proof of life, proof of work. Still, grief doesn't stay still for long. As the months passed, my sister's calls became colder. "You should think about selling the house," she said once, her tone businesslike. "It's not like you're ever there." What she meant was, I want it, but I'd rather make it sound practical. I told her I wasn't ready. She sighed theatrically. "You've always been sentimental," she said. "It's not healthy." I almost told her then, about the brand, about the letters in the paper, about the orders stacking up in my inbox. But I stopped myself. Because for the first time in my life, I had something she couldn't touch, proof that I didn't need her approval, proof that silence was strategy. So when she mocked my clothes at the funeral, I didn't correct her. I let her feel powerful, let her believe the story she'd written in her head. Because the truth was already stitched into every seam I wore, and soon, she'd be the one reading it aloud without even realizing whose words they were. Mr. Grant always carried himself like a man who had seen every kind of family fall apart over money. He had a soft voice and a sharp memory, and he still used a fountain pen to sign documents. When he called to schedule a meeting after Mom's passing, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was how kindly he spoke to me on the phone. "Your mother trusted you with more than you know," he said. The words lingered long after the call ended. The meeting took place in his small office downtown, the kind of place that smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. I arrived early, clutching a folder of my own, nothing official, just sketches I'd been working on for HUMBL's next collection. It felt strange, sitting across from the man who had managed Mom's will, knowing how far apart my sister and I had grown. My sister swept in 10 minutes late, draped in perfume and entitlement. She greeted Mr. Grant like an old friend, crossing her legs and offering a dazzling smile. "Let's make this quick," she said, adjusting her sunglasses on her head. "I have a shoot this afternoon." He smiled politely, as though he'd heard the same tone from dozens of airs before. "Of course," he said, sliding 2 folders across the table. "Your mother's estate is simple enough. She kept excellent records." I watched my sister's expression soften when she realized there wasn't a fortune to divide. Mom had always believed in earning, not hoarding. The house on Sycamore Lane, a few small investments, her sewing equipment, and a modest trust fund, that was it. But then, Mr. Grant pulled out an envelope with her handwriting on the front. My name was written in her careful script. "For you," he said. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short letter and a swatch of fabric folded neatly in half. The letter read, "For every stitch you've made in silence, there will come a time to be seen. Trust what you've built and protect it. Love, Mom." I swallowed hard. My sister leaned in, pretending to be curious. "What's that?" she asked, her tone half innocent. "Just something personal," I said, refolding the letter. Mr. Grant cleared his throat. "Your mother also left behind intellectual property, her old patterns, design notebooks, and a few unpublished sketches. She wanted them kept with someone who understands their value." He looked at me as he said it. My sister frowned. "Wait, patterns, like sewing stuff, why would that even matter?" He smiled mildly. "Because they're registered works, Ms. Ellison. They can be reproduced, licensed, or sold. They hold value." Her face tightened. "So my sister gets drawings," she said, forcing a laugh, "and I get." "You inherit half the financial assets," he said. "But the creative rights and materials were specifically assigned to your sister. It was your mother's request." I could feel my sister's gaze burning into me, her smile hardening into something brittle. She wanted to argue, but there wasn't much to say. Mr. Grant's tone was firm, the kind that closed conversations before they began. When she finally stormed out to take a call, he looked at me with a kind of quiet relief. "You remind me of her," he said. "She never liked loud victories, only steady ones." I laughed softly. She taught me to wait for the right moment. He nodded, then gestured toward my sleeve. "That's a fine suit," he said. "Handmade." I hesitated before answering. "Yes, mine." His eyes lit up, the way people's do when they realize they're in on a secret. "I thought so. The detailing, the inside seam, the initials stitched there, those are your mother's technique. You've adapted it." My throat tightened. It was the first time anyone had noticed, or at least said it out loud. "I'm building something," I admitted quietly. "Small for now, but real." He leaned back, smiling. "Then my advice is simple. Keep your name off it until the foundation is strong enough to stand on its own. People underestimate what they can't see. Let them." His words sank in like an anchor. For years, I'd believed that hiding was cowardice, that my anonymity meant fear. But now, hearing it from someone who understood legacy, it felt like strategy. When my sister came back, she was all charm again, pretending nothing had happened. "So, what now?" she asked breezily. "Do we just sign something?" "Yes," Mr. Grant said. "You'll each receive your respective documents next week." As she gathered her things, she glanced at me and smirked. "Guess Mom really wanted you to have her sewing junk. Good luck turning that into rent money." I didn't respond. I just smiled, small, unshaken. Mr. Grant caught my eye and gave the faintest nod, the kind that says patience, not defense. Outside, the wind caught the corner of my mother's letter as I reread it by the car. "For every stitch you've made in silence, there will come a time to be seen." I folded it carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket. That night, I went back to my studio and placed the letter on my desk beside the trademark certificate for HUMBL, my first legal proof of ownership. It felt like Mom had left me a key I didn't know I needed, and Mr. Grant had just shown me the lock. The embroidery on my sleeve glinted under the light as I rolled it up to start working. I traced the thread with my fingertip, whispering under my breath, "Steady victories." Somehow, it felt like a blessing. The days after meeting Mr. Grant moved in slow motion, like my life had quietly split into two timelines. The one my sister saw, where I was the quiet, underdressed nobody, and the one I actually lived in, where I stitched a brand from scraps and silence. The world hadn't caught up yet, and that was fine. I was learning the value of staying underestimated. But there was one thing Mom's letter kept whispering in my mind: trust what you've built. I couldn't shake it. It felt less like encouragement and more like instruction, so I decided to look closer at what she'd really left behind. Late one night, I drove back to her house. My sister hadn't bothered to clear out anything. She'd hired movers for her half and left the rest. The front door groaned open, and that familiar scent of cedar and fabric dye hit me, the scent of her workroom. The sewing table was still there, the one with tiny etch marks from when I was little and would help her cut fabric. I switched on the desk lamp, and a warm pool of light spread across the room. Stacks of notebooks lined the shelf, some wrapped with elastic bands, others with little sticky notes poking out like bookmarks. Inside one of the notebooks, I found something I hadn't seen in years: a rough pencil sketch of a jacket design she'd never finished. On the corner, in her handwriting, it said, "For A, I traced the lines with my finger, realizing it was the early blueprint of the design that would later become HUMBL's signature piece, the one that made our first collection sell out." I sat there for a long time, just breathing. Then I noticed a folded paper tucked inside the back cover. It was an old receipt dated over 10 years ago from a local tailor supply store. The name listed as purchaser wasn't hers. It was mine. She must have used my name intentionally, maybe to start protecting my identity early. But what caught my eye wasn't that. It was the note written on the bottom: design registered under AME Atelier Holder, A. Ellison. I froze. Mom had registered something in my name years before I even launched my business. This was my first receipt, literal legal proof that she had seen my future before I had. The handwriting, the date, the signature, everything was intact. I didn't know what to do with the surge of emotion that hit me. Pride, grief, gratitude, it all tangled up inside me. So I took out my phone and snapped a clear, time-stamped photo of the page. The first real proof. A few days later, my sister called. Her tone was sugary, fake sweet, the way people sound when they think they're about to manipulate you. "Hey," she said, "so I talked to the estate accountant, and apparently Mom had some kind of brand registration in her files. Did you know about that?" I smiled to myself, remembering the notebook. "A little," I said cautiously. "Why?" She laughed lightly. "Because if it's worth anything, we should probably liquidate it, right? It's just sitting there. I mean, it's not like either of us are going to use it." I didn't correct her. "Let's see what the lawyer says," I said simply. The pause on the other end of the line stretched a second too long. She was waiting for me to offer to negotiate. But I didn't. When she finally hung up, I realized how powerful silence could be. That night, I went through every notebook Mom had left. There were invoices, sketches, drafts of labels, even a half-written licensing agreement with an overseas textile firm. All of it filed neatly, dated, and signed. I began scanning each document, labeling them in a digital folder titled Her Legacy. As I worked, I started to notice a pattern. She'd been slowly transitioning ownership to me in pieces: small registrations, business name filings, supplier accounts, all under my initials. It was as if she'd spent years quietly fortifying my foundation while I thought I was still standing in her shadow. That realization hit deeper than anything else. I wasn't just her daughter, I was her continuation. Every seam I'd ever stitched carried her handwriting somewhere in its DNA. I remember sitting back, rubbing my eyes and whispering, "You saw everything coming, didn't you, Mom?" Outside, rain started to fall, soft, rhythmic, like the hum of her old sewing machine. It was the same sound that used to lull me to sleep when I was little, and now it filled the empty house like a heartbeat. Before leaving, I took one last look around the room. On the windowsill sat her old pin cushion, shaped like a tomato, the same one she'd used for decades. I picked it up, holding it in my palm. One of the pins had a gold head, different from the rest. I plucked it out, and taped underneath was a tiny folded note. "For when they doubt you, keep the proof." I smiled through tears. That was my mother, never dramatic, just deliberate, always leaving her love in small, usable forms. When I got back to my studio, I pinned that gold-headed needle to the wall above my desk. It became my second motif of truth, a reminder that silence isn't weakness when you hold the receipts. And just like that, I knew what came next. My sister wanted to play business with Mom's memory. She had no idea she was standing on ground that already belonged to me, legally, quietly, permanently. She was about to find out that humility doesn't mean invisibility. It means control, waiting for the moment when truth no longer needs to shout. A week later, the tension between my sister and me simmered just beneath the surface. Polite smiles over text, clipped replies about estate logistics, the occasional, "hope you're doing okay," that felt more like reconnaissance than care. I could sense she was circling something, testing the edges of what she could get away with. That was her pattern: charm, manipulate, and if all else failed, discredit. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my next move. My mother's letter had given me direction, but the receipts, literal and emotional, were now my compass. I spent nights at my studio surrounded by evidence: scanned documents, contracts, supplier lists, and design archives. I organized everything into a single binder labeled *HUMBL Origins. It wasn't just paperwork. It was armor. Then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my stomach twist. A local fashion blog had posted a feature about my sister. There she was, smiling in an oversized blazer, one of mine. The caption read, "Influencer style, how Emma Ellison puts a luxe spin on humility chic." I read it twice, my breath catching at the phrase. Humility chic. The irony burned. That phrase wasn't random. It was the tagline of HUMBL's upcoming campaign. The one that hadn't even been announced yet. I scrolled down. The article quoted her. "I've always loved supporting small, sustainable brands. This piece, just a thrift find, but I could totally see it inspiring my own collection one day." I laughed out loud, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief, that particular hollow sound that lives between anger and resignation. My sister was already claiming proximity to something she didn't know she was standing inside of. For years, I'd been invisible by choice. Now I realized invisibility came with a side effect. People think your silence equals absence. That night, I decided to test the edges of my own anonymity. I reached out to a contact at a small but reputable trade registry, someone Mom had introduced me to years ago. I explained that I needed updated verification documents for HUMBL's design registrations and trade name protections. The clerk recognized my mother's name and handled it with quiet efficiency. The next morning, I received an official PDF with my full name listed as the sole owner and founder, time-stamped, notarized, and sealed. My first public proof document, the kind that could be shown, not just told. That same evening, I got an invitation from my sister. "Family dinner, Aunt Marla's hosting. Casual, wear something nice." The message was simple, but the tone it carried that familiar sting of condescension. Casual in her vocabulary usually meant I'm planning to perform. I could have declined, but something told me to go. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was Mom's voice in the back of my mind whispering, "There will come a time to be seen." When I arrived, the room buzzed with chatter. My sister was already at the center of attention, telling a story animatedly while gesturing with her wine glass. She was talking about her plans to launch her own Ecolux brand, how she'd been inspired by simplicity. Every phrase felt like an echo of mine, stripped of sincerity, but I didn't interrupt. I just listened, smiling faintly, my silence measured and deliberate. Aunt Marla spotted me and called out, "Oh, sweetheart, I saw your sister's photo in that magazine. Is that your design she's wearing?" My sister froze for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she laughed lightly. "Oh no, it's just something I found at a vintage shop, but isn't it gorgeous? Maybe I have an eye for these things." I met her gaze across the table. "You definitely do," I said softly, though funny enough, I recognized that stitching anywhere. Her smile faltered. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, taking a sip of water. "Just that the inside seam is hand-bound with double thread. It's a signature technique. My mother taught it to only one person." The room quieted a little, that subtle shift in attention you can feel before a crowd realizes something real is being said. My sister blinked, uncertain how to respond. "Well, maybe the designer just copied it," she said with a nervous laugh. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it's original." I didn't press further. I didn't need to. The silence afterward was the kind that made people start to wonder on their own. After dinner, my aunt pulled me aside in the kitchen. "You've changed," she said softly. "You're not defending yourself anymore." I smiled. "I'm done defending, I'm just documenting." She raised an eyebrow. "You sound like your mother." I wanted to tell her how literal that was, how every word, every pattern, every seam Mom had touched now existed as proof of what I'd built. But I didn't. I simply said, "That's the best compliment I could get." When I got home, I sat down at my desk and looked at the gold-headed pin still taped to the wall. I realized what it really symbolized: precision. The kind that doesn't stab unless necessary. That night, I drafted an email to my lawyer, attaching the notarized ownership document and a short note. "Prepare for possible infringement claims. I'll advise when to act." It wasn't a threat, it was preparation. Quiet, factual, lawful. As I hit send, I thought about my sister's expression at dinner, that flicker of unease behind her practiced smile. It wasn't guilt yet, but it was awareness. The kind that comes when a person realizes the story they're trying to write about you might already have your signature on the last page. The next chapter wouldn't be about confrontation. Not yet. It would be about exposure, gentle, deliberate, undeniable. And this time, the light would be mine to turn on. 2 days after the dinner, I woke up to a string of notifications that turned my stomach before I'd even opened them. My sister had posted a new carousel on her social media, 6 polished photos from a behind-the-scenes shoot for her upcoming capsule line. The caption read, "Creating something close to my heart, a line inspired by humility, legacy, and sustainable craftsmanship. Can't wait to share what I've been working on." I didn't even have to zoom in to recognize the samples she was wearing. The drape of the linen jacket, the hand-finished cuffs, the subtle inner tag visible in one shot where she'd lifted her arm just enough, HUMBL's prototype pieces. Mine. The irony was thick enough to choke on. She'd taken the pieces I'd given Mom as early design samples, the ones still left in the house, and was now passing them off as her creations. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen. My instinct was to comment, to call her out publicly, but something in me stopped. This wasn't the moment to react. This was the moment to record. I took screenshots, every post, every caption, every comment. I documented the time and date. Then I opened a new folder on my computer and named it Echo Collection Evidence. The title was a quiet nod to what this situation was turning into, an echo of my own work being played back by someone else who didn't understand its origin. By noon, my phone rang. It was Mr. Grant. "I just received a rather interesting inquiry from your sister," he said carefully. "About the estate?" I asked, though I already knew. "Yes," he replied. "She asked if there were any unclaimed design rights or creative licenses that could be transferred to her as co-heir. She mentioned starting her own brand." I let out a slow breath. "And what did you tell her?" "That those rights were already registered under you, legally and irrevocably. I also reminded her that your mother's bequest letter clearly stated the intellectual property belonged solely to you." A small, almost reluctant smile tugged at my lips. "How did she take it?" "She was surprised," he said gently, "and I suspect a little embarrassed." After we hung up, I sat in the stillness of my studio. the afternoon light spilling across the cutting table. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from the rush of realizing how close she'd come to crossing a line she didn't even know existed. That evening, I called one of my oldest allies, Myra, a textile supplier who'd worked with me since the earliest days of HUMBL. She met my mother once and had always spoken about her with a kind of reverence. "Myra," I said after explaining everything, "I need a little help. I might need to trace a few material orders. I think someone trying to replicate my designs." Myra didn't hesitate. "Send me the photos," she said. "I'll tell you if any of those fabrics came through me." When I sent the pictures, she called back within the hour. "Yep, that's your material. Same supplier, same dye lot. She must have used your old inventory or your mom's leftovers." I thanked her, feeling both vindicated and unsettled. I hadn't wanted to believe my sister was capable of deliberate theft, but the evidence was stacking up neatly, thread by thread. Myra paused before hanging up. "You know," she said, "your mom once told me something that good fabric remembers its maker. No matter who cuts it next, it always carries the first touch." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Maybe that was true for people, too. Maybe this whole situation was my fabric remembering me. Later that night, I printed out everything. Screenshots, supplier confirmations, my ownership certificate, even the registration numbers from the trade office. Then I went through my inbox and found an email from a buyer dated months before my sister's post, confirming an order for those exact designs. Proof that the concept existed before she ever claimed it. I bundled everything into a single PDF and sent it to Mr. Grant, copying in my lawyer. The subject line read, "Intellectual property breach documentation." It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a filing of truth. Quiet, precise, and timed. When I finished, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. Across the street, a boutique store was closing up for the night. The owner flipped the open sign to closed, and something about that small motion felt symbolic, a reminder that closure doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from completion. As I sipped, my phone buzzed again, a message from my sister. "Hey, I saw you liked my post. Didn't think you'd be into fashion now. Guess Mom rubbed off on both of us." I stared at the screen, considering my response. Then I typed back, "She did. Some lessons just take longer to see." I left it at that. No sarcasm, no anger, just truth in its quietest form. When I finally turned off the lights and walked toward my work table, the gold-headed pin caught a glint of moonlight. I stopped and looked at it for a long moment. It wasn't just a reminder anymore. It was a compass point, steady and unwavering. There would be a time for public truth, not yet, but soon. And when it came, I wouldn't have to raise my voice or make a scene. I would just have to show the receipts. Because in a world that worships loud lies, nothing cuts deeper than calm evidence. The confrontation didn't arrive like a storm. It slipped in quietly, dressed as civility. A week after the email to Mr. Grant and my lawyer, my sister invited the family to brunch at the garden terrace of the Marigold, one of those polished places where people pretend to reconcile over poached eggs. The invitation sounded innocent enough. Let's catch up properly, maybe talk through Mom's legacy with everyone present. I knew what that meant. She was going to make a scene under the disguise of closure. She had always loved performing her virtue, especially in public. And the Marigold, with its open courtyard and waiting audience of other diners, was the perfect stage. I arrived early, dressed deliberately in simplicity, wide-leg ivory trousers, a linen blouse with clean seams, no visible labels. I'd designed it myself, though no one there knew that yet. In my hand, a neat leather folio, my silent script for what was about to unfold. My sister swept in 15 minutes late, her laughter already preceding her. She wore one of the prototype jackets again, my asterisk jacket, but this time she'd altered it slightly, adding a flashy brooch to the lapel as if to stamp her ownership. I noticed she'd brought printed lookbooks, the kind PR people make when they're chasing investors. "Oh good, everyone's here," she said brightly, air-kissing our aunt and uncle before sliding into her seat. I thought this would be a great time to tell you about something exciting. I've decided to launch my own clothing line. Something that honors Mom's creativity, but with my own twist. Sustainable, ethical, minimal. You know, all the right words. The table murmured approval. Aunt Marla clapped lightly. Oh, how wonderful, dear. That's exactly what your mother would have wanted. I stayed quiet, letting the air settle, the narrative weave itself tight enough to be noticed when it finally snapped. My sister went on, flipping through her glossy pages. I'm calling it Elan. It's about elegance through restraint. The prototypes are already getting great responses online. Uncle Greg, who'd always had a soft spot for her, leaned forward. Didn't I see you wearing one of those pieces last week? That jacket looked sharp. She smiled with perfect teeth. Yes, that's one of mine. Handmade, actually. Took weeks to get it right. It was then that Mr. Grant arrived, late but intentional. He told me he might drop by, and I could tell by the subtle lift of his brow that he'd read the room before speaking. Ah, he said pleasantly. Ms. Ellison, Ms. Ellison. His tone had the weight of formality. I hope you don't mind me interrupting. I just wanted to deliver a few estate documents I finalized this morning. He handed 2 envelopes across the table, one for each of us. My sister blinked in surprise but smiled politely. Of course, Mr. Grant, you didn't have to do this here. He smiled. I find clarity prefers daylight. Inside my envelope were confirmations, the finalized transfer of Mom's creative rights, the notarized registry proof, the sealed ownership verification for HUMBL. I didn't need to read them. I already knew every word. My sister tore hers open with practiced nonchalance, expecting the same. Then her expression faltered, just slightly. She reread the first page, her lips parting in confusion. These, she said finally, voice brittle, these say that all creative and design rights were given solely to my sister. That can't be right. We're both heirs. Mr. Grant adjusted his glasses. It's correct, Ms. Ellison. Your mother's directive was specific. The intellectual and artistic assets belong entirely to your sister. The financial holdings were divided evenly. It's all legal, filed, and irrevocable. For a moment, the only sound was the faint clinking of cutlery from nearby tables. My sister laughed, too high, too forced. Okay, well, that's fine. I mean, I'm already developing my own thing anyway, so. I reached into my folio and placed a single printed photo on the table between us. The air seemed to still. It was a side-by-side image, one from her social media post and one from HUMBL's official registry file. The same garment, same stitch, same hem's signature. I just wanted to be sure, I said softly, that everyone here understood which of Mom's legacies you were building on. Her face drained of color. That's not, you can't accuse me of. I'm not accusing, I said gently. I'm clarifying, it's all documented. Trademark filed, designs patented. I even have the purchase receipts for the materials, dated months before your posts. Mr. Grant cleared his throat. She's correct, he said calmly. I've reviewed the documentation myself. The table went silent. Aunt Marla's hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork. Emma, she said softly, you didn't know. My sister looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in years. Her voice cracked when she spoke. I thought it was all Mom's old work. I didn't know. I met her gaze, my tone still quiet, steady. That's the thing. You never thought I could have built something worth claiming. Her eyes filled, whether from shame or anger, I couldn't tell. She pushed her chair back slightly, fumbling for words that wouldn't come. I looked around the table. Mom didn't want a fight. She wanted continuity. So I'm not taking anything from her memory. I'm just protecting what she built and what she left in my hands. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy, the kind that comes when truth rearranges a room. Finally, Mr. Grant stood. If anyone wishes to verify these matters further, he said, glancing at my sister, I can provide copies of all relevant filings. She nodded stiffly, then gathered her bag, muttering something about needing air. As she left, her jacket caught the light and I couldn't help but notice The seams were beginning to fray. When she was gone, Aunt Marla reached over and took my hand. "You didn't raise your voice," she said, almost in wonder. I smiled faintly. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder. Outside, as I walked to my car, the sun caught on the metal clasp of my folio. It gleamed briefly, like that gold-headed pin in my studio, catching light only when necessary. That brunch hadn't been revenge. It was accountability, served quietly, in daylight, in front of witnesses. And somewhere, I hoped, Mom was proud, not of the win, but of the way it was earned. Without cruelty, without noise, but with precision and proof. The hours after the brunch felt strangely calm, as if the air itself had shifted. I'd expected to feel victorious or vindicated, maybe even a little triumphant. But what I actually felt was something quieter, steadier, heavier. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from finally being *seen. That evening, my phone stayed silent. No apology text, no follow-up call from my sister. Just a long stretch of stillness that said more than words could. I didn't rush it. I'd learned that silence has its own gravity. It pulls the truth toward itself eventually. But the world doesn't stop just because someone gets caught in a lie. The next morning, HUMBL's inbox pinged with a message from a fashion columnist I'd admired for years. "We came across an interesting story about legacy craftsmanship," it began. "Would you be open to discussing your work and your connection to your late mother's techniques for a feature on authenticity in modern fashion?" I read it twice, the corners of my mouth curving before I realized I was smiling. The timing was poetic. Without any effort on my part, the narrative was already shifting from obscurity to legitimacy. My mother's invisible thread was working still. That afternoon, I went to Mr. Grant's office again. He looked up from his paperwork as I entered, that same calm expression softening his face. "I had a feeling you'd come by," he said. "I just wanted to thank you," I replied. "Not just for today, for how you handled everything. You could have told her privately, but you chose daylight." He smiled knowingly. Daylight is fair. It leaves no room for revision. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You know, your mother once told me something I didn't understand until now. She said, 'My daughters will inherit the same pattern, but only one will know how to cut it.'" I sat with that for a long moment. "That sounds like her," I said quietly. He nodded. "She saw further than either of you could. She didn't leave you an empire, she left you the truth. And you've carried it with grace." When I left his office, the sun was setting low over the street, casting long orange streaks against the windows of downtown. I found myself staring at my reflection in a storefront, the glass catching both the woman I was and the faint ghost of my mother behind her. We shared the same tilt of the chin, the same calm gaze. For the first time, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like a continuation. That night, while sorting through the last of Mom's notebooks, I found something I'd missed before. Folded between 2 pages of sketches was a letter addressed simply, "For when the truth becomes heavy." I opened it carefully. Her handwriting was steady, deliberate. "My darling girl, *. People will tell you that humility means shrinking. It doesn't. It means standing tall without the noise. I hope, when the time comes, you won't let anger guide your hands. The truth, when handled quietly, will always leave you lighter than revenge ever could. Love always, Mom." I sat there for a long time, reading those words until they blurred. She must have known that one day this would happen, that one day I'd be sitting in that same chair, holding proof of both betrayal and validation, deciding which one to keep in my heart. Eventually, I folded the letter and slipped it into my folio beside the legal documents. Not as evidence this time, but as balance. The next day, my sister finally reached out. The message was short. "Can we talk?" I hesitated before replying. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her stew in her own discomfort. But another part of me remembered Mom's words about staying light. So I typed back, "Tomorrow at the studio." When she arrived, she was quieter than I'd ever seen her. No perfume cloud, no dramatic entrance, just a faint awkwardness that almost felt human. She glanced around the space, the bolts of fabric, the pattern racks, the dress forms lined up like silent witnesses. "This is where it all happens," she murmured. "I didn't realize it was so," she trailed off. "Small," I offered gently. She met my eyes. "Real," she said. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. We sat at the long cutting table, the same one Mom and I used to share when she taught me to draft patterns. My sister fidgeted with a loose thread on her sleeve before speaking. "I messed up," she said finally. "I got caught up in the image. The followers, the attention, it felt like love, you know." I didn't answer right away. I let her words hang, honest and uncomfortable. "You hurt me," I said finally, my voice soft but steady. "Not just because of what you did, but because you never thought I could have done this without you finding out first." Her eyes welled. "I didn't think you'd still be doing it," she whispered. "You never talked about your work, you just disappeared into it." I exhaled slowly. That was the point. I wanted to build something that spoke for itself. We sat in silence after that, the hum of the city drifting faintly through the open window. For a moment, it almost felt like peace. Then she said, "What happens now?" I looked at the gold-headed pin still glinting on the wall and thought of Mom's last letter. "Now," I said, "we let the truth settle, and we see what survives it." Her eyes followed mine to the pin. "She gave you that." "She left it for me to find," I said, "like everything else." She nodded slowly, as if finally understanding how much she'd missed, not just in me, but in the legacy she'd been too loud to listen to. As she left, she paused at the door. "You were always her favorite," she said quietly, not bitter, not jealous, just resigned. I shook my head. No, I was just the one who paid attention. When the door closed behind her, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The studio felt still again, calm and intact. For the first time in years, I felt something close to freedom. Not because I'd won, but because I'd chosen not to destroy. The truth had done that on its own, cleanly, quietly, like a final stitch closing a wound from the inside. And somewhere in that silence, I swear I could hear Mom's sewing machine again, soft, rhythmic, and certain, just like it used to sound when she worked late into the night, creating something beautiful from what everyone else had overlooked. The morning after our talk, I woke to a strange stillness in the air, the kind that feels like a sigh after a storm. The house was quiet, sunlight spilling through the sheer curtains like it was deliberately trying not to disturb anything. For the first time in weeks, my body didn't carry the weight of waiting for something to collapse. It had already happened. The truth had done its work, and all that was left now were the echoes, small, soft, and fatting. As I brewed coffee, I caught myself glancing toward the stack of documents on my dining table, the ones I'd used to defend my name. The trade registrations, the estate letters, the time-stamped evidence. They looked less like weapons now and more like proof that I'd survived something I didn't even realize had been draining me for years. Proof that staying quiet doesn't always mean being weak. Sometimes it's just being certain. My phone buzzed mid-morning. It was Mr. Grant again. His tone carried a kind of measured satisfaction. "I thought you'd want to know," he said. "Your sister contacted me this morning. She wants to transfer the remaining estate shares of your mother's workshop to your name." I blinked, unsure I'd heard him right. "She what?" "She said she doesn't want to complicate things anymore," he continued. "Apparently, she's realized her energy is better spent elsewhere. She even asked if she could make a formal apology through me, for the record." A pause hung between us before I answered. "Tell her she doesn't need to apologize through paper, just through action." He hummed softly, the way people do when they agree, but know the other person's answer holds more weight than they can comment on. "Your mother would have been proud of how you've handled all this," he said before hanging up. For a long time after that call, I sat in the quiet. My hands wrapped around my mug, the steam tracing lazy ribbons in the air. I thought about how easily this could have gone another way. The confrontation, the humiliation, the endless online spectacle it could have turned into. But instead, I'd stayed still, anchored by truth and a mother's quiet lessons. That afternoon, I went to the old workshop one last time before signing the transfer papers. The building still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil, the scent of every late night Mom had ever spent here. Dust clung to the shelves, threads hung from the spools like tiny veins of color frozen mid-breath. I walked to the back corner where her old dress form stood, still pinned with the half-finished linen blouse she'd been working on before she got sick. I ran my fingers along the fabric, feeling the tiny, uneven stitches she'd started by hand. There was a note pinned near the collar, faded and wrinkled. In her handwriting, it read, "Perfection is never loud." I didn't even realize I was crying until a tear hit the fabric. I stepped back, took a deep breath, and looked around the room, the bolts of fabric, the cutting table, the pattern drafts pinned to corkboards like old constellations. Every inch of this place was her patience, her precision, her way of teaching without words. I pulled out my phone and took a picture, not for social media, not for proof, just to keep her close. When I returned home that evening, I drafted a short email to my legal team confirming the transfer acceptance. My sister had done the right thing, quietly, without spectacle. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger when I thought of her. I felt something closer to understanding. We'd both inherited the same legacy, just in different languages. Mine was truth, hers was lesson. That night, I sat by the window with my sketchbook open. The gold-headed pin was still there, catching the lamplight like a little flame. I picked it up and set it beside my pencil, pressing it lightly into the page where I'd started a new sketch. The outline of a dress began to take shape, structured but soft, classic with an edge. At the top of the page, I wrote a single word, proof. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about transformation, how proof can start as evidence and end as creation. Later, I scrolled through my sister's social media again. Her last few posts were quiet, no photo shoots, no polished captions. Just a single story from earlier that day, a photo of a sewing needle resting on a wooden table. The caption said, "Starting over." I stared at it longer than I expected. Then I smiled, not in triumph, but in recognition. Maybe, in her own way, she'd found her humility after all. When I finally turned off the lights, I whispered a small thank you to the dark, for holding me through the quiet battles, for not letting me lose myself in the noise. The truth had done what it was meant to do. Not destroy, not humiliate, just reveal. And in that revelation, something new had begun. The next morning, I'd step into my studio again, open the windows wide, and let the light touch everything it needed to. Because now, there was nothing left to hide. A few weeks passed before I realized that peace doesn't arrive with a grand announcement. It just settles in quietly, like sunlight creeping across the floor until the whole room is bright. Life began to move again, not in big, dramatic turns, but in small, steady rhythms. Fabric orders, client calls, late-night sketches. For the first time in years, my work felt unburdened. It was no longer about proving I belonged. It was about creating because I could. I spent most mornings at the studio, the one I'd built after everything unfolded. The hum of the machines was almost meditative, each whirring sound grounding me. There were moments I'd look up and expect to see Mom there, her hair tied back with a ribbon, glasses perched on her head, measuring tape draped around her neck. But instead, there was just me, my reflection in the window, and that same quiet determination she once carried. One afternoon, I received an invitation from the editor who'd reached out weeks earlier. They wanted to feature HUMBL in their print issue, not for drama, not for scandal, but for integrity. The story's title made me smile, the brand that chose silence over spectacle. During the interview, the editor asked gently, "Did you ever want to go public about what happened, name names, clear the air?" I hesitated, my fingers tracing the rim of my teacup before I answered. "No," I said, "because the truth doesn't need an audience to be true, it just needs to exist." The editor smiled, jotting down notes. "That's rare," she said softly. "Most people want vindication." "I had it," I replied, "just not the kind that trends." After she left, I walked through the studio, checking on each piece my team was working on. There was something almost sacred about the way the fabric caught the light, quiet proof of effort, not ego. On one table sat a prototype of a dress I'd been developing for months. Its lining was stitched with a hidden phrase, embroidered in gold thread. Perfection is never loud. The same words from Mom's old note. I decided then that the collection would carry that name, never loud. A quiet nod to the journey, the lessons, and the grace it took not to let anger define me. A few days later, I received an unexpected delivery at the studio, a parcel with no sender listed, just my name written in familiar handwriting. My chest tightened before I even opened it. Inside was a neatly folded piece of linen, the same kind Mom used to use, and a short note from my sister. I found this while cleaning out the old house. Thought you might want it. Thank you for not ruining me when you could have. I'm learning. I read it twice, my throat tightening. For a long time, I just stood there, holding that small piece of fabric, the same kind she'd once used to pretend, now turned into something like reconciliation. Later that week, she showed up at the studio, this time unannounced but calm. She wasn't dressed for a performance, no designer bag, no camera-ready outfit. Just jeans, a plain shirt, and eyes that carried a kind of tired humility. I wanted to see what you've built, she said quietly. I led her around the space. She touched the fabrics, ran her fingers over the spools, watched the team work in silence. At one point, she turned to me and said, "You really did it. I used to think you were wasting your time." "I know," I said gently, "and that's okay." We ended up sitting by the window, drinking coffee the way we used to before everything fractured. She looked out at the city and sighed. "It's funny, I always thought attention was power, but the moment you stood there, calm and unshaken, I realized I'd never had any." "That's the thing about noise," I said. "It disappears faster than silence." She smiled faintly, her eyes glassy but not breaking. "You're turning into her, you know." I looked down at my hands, the same hands that once trembled under her judgment, now steady and still. Maybe that's the best thing I could ever become. Before she left, she stopped at the wall where the gold-headed pin was still displayed. "You kept it," she said softly. "It kept me," I corrected. She nodded, and in that small exchange, I felt something mend, not completely, but enough to breathe easier. After she walked out, I stood by the window for a while, watching her fade into the evening crowd. For the first time, I didn't feel bitterness when I looked at her. Just a quiet kind of empathy, the kind you reserve for someone who finally sees their own reflection clearly. That night, I added one last line to the Never Loud collection notes, dedicated to those who learned that quiet doesn't mean small. Because that's what this had all been about, not revenge, not exposure, but the slow, graceful power of being unshakably sure. And as I turned off the studio lights, the gold-headed pin caught one last glimmer of light before the room went dark. It was no longer just a reminder of the past. It was proof that every wound stitched with patience eventually becomes part of the design. The day of the launch arrived quietly, like most important days do. No fireworks, no chaos, just the kind of soft anticipation that hums underneath the surface when you know you're standing at the start of something honest. The studio had been transformed into a gallery of sorts. White walls, soft lighting, every piece from the Never Loud collection displayed with the kind of deliberate care that would have made Mom proud. The air carried the faint scent of linen and cedarwood, the same scent that used to fill her old workshop. I'd even placed one of her vintage sewing machines in the corner, a silent witness, an anchor between what was lost and what had finally taken shape. As guests began to arrive, editors, buyers, friends, I stood near the entrance, calm but alert, watching the way their eyes softened when they touched the fabric, when they noticed the details that weren't screaming for attention but inviting it gently. That was the entire point. Halfway through the evening, I caught sight of her, my sister, standing at the back of the room. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't performing either. Dressed simply, hands clasped, eyes scanning the space as though she were seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. Our eyes met briefly, and for a moment it felt like time folded in on itself. There was no rivalry there anymore, just recognition. The curator of the event approached me then, holding a microphone. "Would you like to say a few words before we unveil the final piece?" I hesitated. Public speaking was never my comfort zone, but something inside me said this was the moment, not for spectacle, but for truth. I stepped forward, The crowd hushed in that expectant way crowds do, the air thick with attention. I took a breath. When I started this line, I began, my voice low but steady. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to keep a promise. A small murmur rippled through the room. My mother taught me that craft and character are the same thing. You can't fake either for long. She believed that the truest work doesn't shout for validation. It just exists and lets time prove its worth. I glanced toward the sewing machine in the corner, then back at the audience. This collection isn't about perfection. It's about patience. It's about knowing when to stay quiet and when to stand firm. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is remain calm in the face of noise. There was a pause, a long, heavy one, and then soft applause began, building until the room felt warm with it. When the final piece was unveiled, a flowing linen gown embroidered with the words, "Perfection is never loud," along the inside hem, the applause grew. But I didn't hear it as celebration. It sounded more like release. After the guests began to mingle again, my sister approached me. She didn't say much, just reached out and touched the gown lightly, tracing the embroidery with her fingers. "She would have loved this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She already does," I replied. She smiled then, small, real, fragile. "I'm glad you didn't give up, even when I made it hard to keep going." "You just gave me contrast," I said softly. "Every story needs it." She let out a faint laugh, one that didn't quite hide the tears forming in her eyes. "You're different now." "No," I said. "I'm just finally visible." Later, after the event wound down and the last of the guests had left, I stayed behind in the empty space. The soft music still played in the background, echoing faintly against the walls. I walked over to the gold-headed pin now displayed in a glass frame beside Mom's old machine. The light caught it perfectly, casting a delicate shadow that looked almost like a stitch drawn across the wall. I thought about everything that had happened: the funeral, the mockery, the quiet investigation, the exposure, the choice to forgive. It all felt like one long pattern, each event a seam that, when pulled together, made something whole. My sister reappeared at the door just as I was about to turn off the lights. She held her phone out toward me. "Can we take a photo, just us, for Mom?" For a second, I hesitated, old habits whispering doubt, but then I nodded. We stood side by side, the display glowing softly behind us. No filters, no forced smiles, just two women stitched together by blood, mistakes, and the kind of understanding that only truth can teach. After she left, I lingered in the silence. I placed the gold-headed pin back on the table beside me, where it first belonged. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a receipt of grace, of patience, of every quiet choice that led me here. As I locked the door and stepped out into the cool night, I realized that justice hadn't come from humiliation or revenge. It had come from standing still when everything in me wanted to scream. It came from letting the truth arrive in its own time, and it had, perfectly measured, like a final stitch closing a seam that would never unravel again. The world outside was calm, streetlights hummed. Somewhere a shopkeeper turned his sign from open to closed, and for the first time since that funeral, I didn't feel small or unseen. I felt finished and free. The following week unfolded like an exhale I'd been holding for years. There were no more legal papers, no awkward explanations, no family gossip buzzing through group chats. Just stillness, the kind that feels earned, like the quiet after a storm that finally understands it's done. I woke each morning before dawn and walked to the studio while the streets were still half asleep. The air was cool, carrying the faint hum of early delivery trucks and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. Each step felt like something being released, a bit of tension, a bit of fear, all melting into the rhythm of a new beginning. Inside, the studio felt different now. Lighter. I noticed small things I'd never really seen before, the way the morning light hit the bolts of fabric, the faint rustle when the curtains moved, the echo of my own footsteps across the wooden floor. The gold-headed pin still rested in its frame by the window, catching the sunrise. It glowed softly, like it was breathing. That morning, I found a message from my sister waiting in my inbox. Just a single line, I enrolled in a sewing class today. No emojis, no long explanations, but somehow it felt monumental. It was the first time she wasn't pretending to already know everything. The first time she'd chosen to start small. I typed back, "Good. It's harder than it looks, but worth every stitch." After sending it, I sat for a while, watching the city come alive outside my window. People rushing, horns blaring, life happening. For so long, I'd felt like I was running behind it all, trying to catch up, trying to prove something. But now I realized I wasn't behind. I was simply on a different track entirely. Later that day, Myra dropped by with a bouquet of wildflowers. "I just wanted to see it all in person," she said, her eyes sweeping over the new collection displayed around the room. "Your mom would be, well, she'd probably tell you to lower the hems by an inch, but she'd still be proud." We both laughed, the sound breaking the quiet in a way that felt warm. "I don't think I ever told you," I said, "but she used to make me redo entire garments if a single seam wasn't straight. I hated it then. Now I understand she wasn't teaching me about sewing, she was teaching me about integrity." Myra nodded. "And patience. You've got both now. That's a dangerous combination in the best way." When she left, I walked around the studio, running my fingers along the edge of each display. Every piece in the never loud line carried a part of that journey, a whisper of restraint, a quiet defiance, a refusal to let noise define worth. But it wasn't just a collection anymore. It was closure disguised as fabric. Proof that grace, when held long enough, turns into strength. That evening, as the sun began to set, I packed up early and took a walk to Mom's old house. The place had been sold, but the new owners hadn't changed much. The porch still had her wind chimes, faded and a little rusted, but still singing softly when the breeze passed. I stood there for a long moment, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to reclaim anything. Everything I needed from that house was already living in me. The precision in my hands, the calm in my choices, the quiet power that came from doing what's right without announcing it. On my way back, I stopped at the bakery and bought 2 small loaves of bread, the same kind Mom used to bring home when we were kids. I placed one on the counter when I got home, tore the other in half, and ate it slowly, smiling to myself. I thought about how strange it was, how justice, when done right, doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like peace. Sometimes it just feels like standing still and realizing you don't have to fight anymore. Before bed, I lit a candle and placed it near the framed pin. The flame flickered, reflecting softly off the glass, turning it gold and alive. "I kept the promise, Mom," I whispered into the quiet, "and I didn't have to raise my voice." The candle's light danced like it understood. And as I watched it, I realized that grace wasn't the absence of power. It was the discipline to use power gently, to let the truth stand alone without pushing it forward. That night, sleep came easily. The storm inside me had finally gone quiet, replaced by something steady, something like belonging. I wasn't the girl mocked for her clothes anymore. I wasn't the shadow hiding behind her mother's name. I was the maker now, the one who stitched patience into legacy and turned silence into proof. Months later, life had folded back into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply familiar, like finding your way home through a street you used to walk as a child. The noise of the scandal, the whispers, the questions, all of it had faded into something distant, barely an echo. What remained was the quiet work, the kind that builds meaning thread by thread. The Never Loud collection had done better than I expected. Not viral, not flashy, but steady. Orders came in slowly, from people who noticed the details, who appreciated the hand-stitching, who said things like, "You can feel the care in this piece." That was the kind of success I wanted. Not the kind that burns bright and disappears, but the kind that stays, like a legacy that doesn't have to be shouted to be remembered. My sister and I talked sometimes, mostly short messages or quick calls. It wasn't the kind of closeness we'd had as kids, but something quieter, more careful. She was working at a small studio now, helping with pattern cutting and fabric sourcing. Every so often, she'd send me pictures of her progress, uneven stitches, a half-finished hem, a crooked dart, and I'd give her gentle advice. It wasn't forgiveness that bridged the gap between us, it was work. Doing, not declaring. That was how we rebuilt. One afternoon, she sent me a photo of a small coin purse she'd made, linen with a hand-stitched emblem at the corner. She wrote, "Not perfect, but mine." I smiled at my screen for a long time before replying. That's where perfection starts. Later that week, I sat down to plan the next season's collection. I'd chosen a new motif this time, keys. Simple, unassuming, symbolic. Each design would feature a hidden detail shaped like a key, embroidered in a seam, etched into a clasp, or stitched inside a lining. Not because keys unlock doors, but because they remind us that some doors only open when you've done the quiet work of earning them. As I sketched, I felt the same calm I'd felt that first night in the studio, the calm of having nothing left to prove. Every line on the page was a whisper of that long journey from humiliation to harmony, from mockery to meaning. That evening, I attended a small community exhibition for local designers. It wasn't glamorous, no red carpet, no cameras, but it was full of people who worked with their hands, who understood fabric the way musicians understand notes. My sister was there too, showing her first solo piece. When she saw me, she looked nervous, unsure if I'd even stop by her booth, but I did. Her design was simple, a wrap blouse in pale beige with a single golden stitch along the cuff. My breath caught. "You remembered," I said softly, touching the thread. Her lips trembled into a smile. "Some lessons don't fade," she replied. In that moment, it didn't feel like victory or reconciliation. It just felt right, like the story had finally closed its last seam. Later, as the evening wound down, I stood near the exit, watching the crowd filter out. Someone from the press approached me and asked, "What's the secret to lasting in this industry?" Everyone, chasing the next big thing. I thought for a moment, then said, "Patience, the willingness to let truth work slowly, and knowing that the best fabric, like the best people, doesn't fray when you stop defending it." She smiled, scribbling down the quote, but I wasn't saying it for her. I was saying it for me, for Mom, for the years I'd spent stitching my way back to solid ground, for the quiet grace that held me when anger could have ruined everything. When I got home that night, I found myself back in front of the framed, gold-headed pin. It caught the lamplight just the same way it always had, the reflection soft and steady. I touched the glass lightly, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. That pin had started as a symbol of loss, a relic of what my mother left behind. But now it was something else entirely. It was a compass that had pointed me through grief, through betrayal, through the long silence that taught me the difference between weakness and restraint. I whispered, "We did it, Mom," not as a triumph, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the story she began in her sewing room had found its ending, not with applause, not with revenge, but with understanding. The candle by the window flickered, and for a moment, it looked as though the pin glowed brighter, like it was answering back. And as I turned off the lights and stepped into the soft dark, I realized the truth of it all. The most powerful justice isn't loud or swift. It's slow, deliberate, and earned. Just like a well-made garment, it holds. It endures. It fits perfectly when you finally wear it without fear.